Harold trudged along the busy city streets, his tattered coat flapping in the winter wind. The snow crunched beneath his worn-out shoes, and his fingers trembled as he clutched a small bag containing his few belongings. The towering buildings around him cast long shadows, making the man seem even smaller. His hollow eyes darted toward a grand hotel ahead, its golden sign gleaming, the gilded crown. For a moment, he hesitated. The place reeked of luxury, a stark contrast to his modest and unkempt appearance. With a deep breath, Harold pushed open the gilded doors. Warmth and light flooded over him as he stepped into the lavish lobby. Polished marble floors reflected the golden chandeliers above, and an elegant piano softly played in the background. The sight was breathtaking, but the stares were sharp. Guests in designer coats whispered among themselves, their gazes heavy with judgment. Harold pretended not to notice, clutching the small sum of money in his pocket. As he approached the front desk, his movements were tentative, his body hunched as if bracing for impact. The receptionist, Amanda, looked up from her computer. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped the counter impatiently. "Yes?" she asked, her voice clipped. Harold smiled faintly, his breath visible in the cold air still clinging to him. "I'd like a room, please," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. Amanda's brow furrowed. Her eyes scanned him from head to toe, pausing on his frayed scarf and patched boots. "We have no vacancies," she said curtly. Harold's heart sank. "But I saw online," he started, only to be cut off. "We're fully booked," Amanda repeated, her tone sharp. Guests nearby chuckled quietly, and Harold felt the weight of their laughter like a physical blow. Humiliated but determined, Harold refused to leave. "I can pay," he said, pulling out a small, neatly folded bundle of bills. Amanda leaned back, her lips curling into a smirk. "I don't think you understand," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "This establishment isn't for people like you." A ripple of laughter spread through the lobby. Nearby, Julia, a young woman in her late 20s, sipped her tea in the lounge. She wore a sharp navy blazer, her polished heels crossed neatly under her chair. Her attention shifted to the commotion at the desk. As she watched the scene unfold, her irritation grew. Then, something caught her eye. On Harold's wrist was a watch, old but ornate, with a crest engraved into its face. Julia froze, her breath catching in her throat. Rising from her seat, she made her way to the counter, heels clicking against the marble. The other guests looked on, curious about her intentions. Julia's sharp eyes met Amanda's, and she spoke with quiet authority. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. Amanda hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond to someone who exuded power. Julia turned to Harold, offering a warm smile that contrasted with Amanda's coldness. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked. Harold blinked in surprise, nodding slowly. I only wanted a room," he murmured, his voice tinged with shame. Julia nodded thoughtfully, then fixed Amanda with a piercing stare. "You will provide this man with a room." Immediately. Amanda's lips thinned. "Miss, I don't think you understand. We have policies," she began, but Julia raised a hand to silence her. "And I don't think you understand," Julia said firmly. "This man deserves the same respect as anyone else." Amanda faltered, but the guests watching closely emboldened her defiance. "It's not about respect. It's about standards," she said, her tone defensive. As the tension mounted, Julia stepped closer to Harold. Her gaze dropped to the watch on his wrist. "That's an interesting piece," she said softly, her fingers brushing the air near it. "Where did you get it?" Harold looked down, his expression unreadable. "It was a gift," he said simply, his voice heavy with memories. Julia's mind raced. That crest, she was sure, matched the one her grandfather used on his belongings. The intricate design, a lion surrounded by oak leaves, was unmistakable. "Who gave it to you?" she pressed, her voice shaking slightly. Harold hesitated, sensing the crowd's curiosity. "A dear friend," he said at last. "Many years ago." Julia's heart pounded. Her grandfather had once told her of a close companion, someone he considered more than a friend, a partner in life's endeavors. Could Harold be that man? She studied him more closely, noting the faint trace of dignity beneath his worn exterior. Turning to Amanda, Julia's tone became commanding. "Book him a room." "Use my name if necessary," she said, pulling out her credit card. The receptionist glanced between Julia and Harold before reluctantly complying. Harold's eyes widened in gratitude, but Julia's thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in memories and questions. Amanda, clearly irritated, handed Harold a keycard with an audible sigh. "Room 312, she muttered. Harold accepted it with trembling hands, murmuring a quiet thank you. Julia watched the exchange, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I hope this is the last time we see such behavior," she said, her voice sharp as a blade. Amanda's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing. The crowd, sensing the tension had eased, began to disperse, though whispers lingered in the air. Julia turned back to Harold, her expression softening. "Please, allow me to walk you to your room," she offered. Harold hesitated but eventually nodded, grateful for her kindness. As they walked toward the elevator, Julia couldn't help but glance at the watch again. The mystery behind it gnawed at her, each tick of its hand urging her to dig deeper. Harold, meanwhile, felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. For years, he had avoided drawing attention to himself. Now, he was at the center of a story yet to unfold. Inside the elevator, Julia turned to Harold, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "If you don't mind me asking, where did you get that watch?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. Harold hesitated, his grip tightening on the keycard. "It's a long story," he murmured. Julia nodded, respecting his reluctance, but her determination didn't waver. They stepped into the hallway, and Harold fumbled with the key before unlocking the door to his modest room. The space was clean but small, with a single bed and a window overlooking the bustling street below. "Thank you," Harold said softly, setting his bag on the bed. "You didn't have to do this." Julia smiled faintly, pulling a chair to sit across from him. "I think I did," she said, her gaze falling once more on the watch. "That piece you're wearing, it bears my family crest. My grandfather used that design for a series of watches he created long ago. He spoke of gifting one to someone very important to him." Harold's eyes widened. He looked down at the watch, brushing his fingers over its face. "Your grandfather was Edmund Gray?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Julia nodded, her heart pounding. "Yes." "Did you know him?" For a moment, Harold seemed lost in thought. "I didn't just know him," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "He was my closest friend. We built a business together, long before he became the renowned jeweler everyone remembers. He gave me this watch as a token of our partnership." Julia leaned forward, her breath catching. "But why? Why did we never hear of you?" she asked. Harold sighed, the weight of his past pressing down on him. "A fire destroyed everything," he said simply. "Our workshop, our dreams, and my family. After that, I couldn't face the world we built together. I walked away." As Julia listened, the pieces of Harold's story began to fall into place. She thought of the stories her father had told her about Edmund's early struggles, about a mysterious partner who vanished without a trace. "You disappeared," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Harold nodded, his weathered face lined with regret. "I thought I was doing what was best. But walking away only left a deeper void." His eyes glistened as he looked at Julia. "I never imagined I'd meet someone from his family again. You look just like him." Julia felt a lump form in her throat. The quiet reverence in Harold's voice made her realize the depth of his connection to her grandfather. "You're a part of our story," she said softly. "And it's time the world knew that." The next morning, Julia found herself unable to stop thinking about Harold's words. At breakfast in the hotel's dining room, she noticed Amanda behind the front desk, her demeanor as icy as ever. Julia approached her, her expression firm. "Amanda, I hope you've reflected on yesterday's behavior," she said. Amanda flushed but tried to maintain her composure. "I was just following protocol," she muttered. Julia's voice dropped, sharp and unforgiving. "Protocol doesn't justify humiliating someone. That man you dismissed so easily has a connection to a legacy greater than you'll ever understand." The reprimand left Amanda speechless. Julia didn't wait for a response. Turning on her heel, she left the lobby, determined to uncover more of Harold's story. Later that day, Julia invited Harold to lunch at a quiet cafe near the hotel. Over steaming cups of tea, she encouraged him to share more of his life. Harold spoke haltingly at first but soon found his voice as he recounted tales of his partnership with Edmund. "We worked tirelessly in those early days," he said, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Edmund was the visionary, always dreaming big. I was the pragmatist, ensuring the plans came to life." He smiled faintly. "That watch was the first piece we ever completed. He insisted I keep it." Julia listened intently, her admiration for Harold growing with each word. "You deserve to be remembered for the role you played," she said. Harold shook his head. "I don't need recognition," he replied. "But knowing Edmund's family has carried on his dream, that's enough for me." That evening, Julia returned to her family home, her thoughts consumed by Harold's story. She rummaged through her father's old documents, searching for any mention of Harold. In a dusty box, she found what she was looking for, a will written by Edmund Gray. Her eyes scanned the lines, her breath catching as she read the words, "To my dear friend and partner, Harold Lewis, I leave an equal share of the business we built together." Julia's hands trembled. The will had never been executed. Harold had never received what was rightfully his. The following morning, Julia confronted her father with the will. "Why didn't we know about this?" she demanded. Her father, startled, read the document carefully. "I had no idea," he admitted. "This was hidden away after the fire. We thought Harold was gone." Julia's resolve hardened. "We need to make this right," she said. "He gave up everything, and it's time we honor his contributions." Her father nodded, moved by her determination. "You're right," he said. "Let's start by bringing Harold back into the fold." At the hotel, Amanda was summoned to meet with Julia and Harold. The receptionist, still defensive, entered the room reluctantly. Julia wasted no time. "I trust you've reconsidered your approach to customer service," she said, her tone icy. Amanda's gaze flicked to Harold, who stood quietly beside Julia. "I'm sorry," Amanda said, her voice barely above a whisper. Harold smiled gently. "It's not me you need to apologize to," he said. "It's yourself. Kindness costs nothing, and it enriches everyone." Amanda nodded, her cheeks flushed with shame. The encounter left her thoughtful, her icy exterior beginning to thaw. Julia invited Harold to her family estate, a sprawling property filled with the echoes of history. As they entered the grand hall, Harold paused, his eyes sweeping over the familiar decor. "It hasn't changed much," he murmured, his voice tinged with nostalgia. Julia led him to a parlor where her father waited. "Dad, this is Harold Lewis," she introduced. Her father extended a hand, his expression warm but filled with regret. "Mr. Lewis, it's an honor to meet you. I can't imagine the hardships you've endured. My father spoke of you often, with the highest respect." Harold shook the offered hand, humility in every movement. "I appreciate that," he said softly. "But I never expected to find myself here again." Julia smiled. "You belong here, Harold. This isn't just our legacy, it's yours too." Julia brought out the will, placing it on the table between them. Harold stared at the document, his expression unreadable. "I never knew," he said, his voice barely audible. Julia's father leaned forward. "We're going to make this right, Harold. My father's wishes will be honored." Harold shook his head slowly. "I'm not sure what to say. I never sought anything in return for what we built. It was enough to know Edmund succeeded." Julia interrupted gently, "But you deserve this. It's not just about the money or the legacy. It's about restoring your rightful place in this family's history." Harold's hands trembled as he held the will. Memories of the past flooded back, days spent designing, nights filled with laughter and ambition. He nodded finally, a small, grateful smile breaking through his weathered face. The next week, Julia and her father announced plans to relaunch a jewelry line based on Harold's original designs. Harold, though hesitant, agreed to oversee the project. "I'm not sure I'm up to it," he admitted. Julia placed a reassuring hand on his. "We'll do it together," she said. They delved into the archives, unearthing old sketches and blueprints Harold had once created with Edmund. Each design told a story, and Harold's passion reignited as he explained the inspirations behind them. "This piece," he said, holding up a delicate sketch of a pendant, was for Edmund's wife. He wanted something timeless, like their love. Julia marveled at Harold's craftsmanship, her admiration growing. "These designs are extraordinary," she said. "They deserve to be seen." Harold smiled, the first genuine expression of pride he'd worn in years. "Then let's make it happen." Despite their enthusiasm, not everyone was supportive of Harold's return. Extended family members and board members expressed doubt about his abilities and intentions. "Are we sure about this?" one executive asked during a meeting. "He's been out of the industry for decades." Julia stood her ground. "Harold is the reason this company exists," she said firmly. "Without his contributions, there would be no legacy to protect." Her father added, "If my father trusted him, so do I." We owe him the opportunity to reclaim his work." Harold listened quietly, his humility disarming even his harshest critics. "I understand your concerns," he said. "But I assure you, my only goal is to honor Edmund's memory and contribute in any way I can." The sincerity in his voice silenced the room, and one by one, the dissenters relented. The first collection of the revived jewelry line debuted at a private event hosted by Julia's family. The pieces, inspired by Harold's original designs, were crafted with meticulous care and attention to detail. Guests marveled at the collection, their admiration palpable. Harold stood in the corner, overwhelmed by the glowing reception. Julia approached him, her eyes shining. "Look around, Harold," she said. "This is your work. You've brought beauty back into the world." Harold smiled, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. "It feels like a dream," he said. "One I never thought I'd see again." Julia placed a hand on his shoulder. "And this is only the beginning." The media caught wind of Harold's story, and soon, newspapers and television segments celebrated his contributions. "Forgotten partner of legendary jeweler returns," one headline proclaimed. The renewed attention brought Harold a level of recognition he had never sought but deeply appreciated. Reporters clamored to interview him, and Harold, though reluctant, shared his journey. "It's not about fame," he said during one interview. "It's about remembering what truly matters: friendship, perseverance, and the beauty we can create together." His words resonated, and the public embraced his story. Orders for the jewelry line poured in, securing its success and ensuring Harold's legacy would endure. On a quiet Sunday morning, Julia accompanied Harold to the family cemetery. They stood before Edmund's grave, the winter wind rustling the leaves. Harold knelt, placing a small bouquet of flowers at the headstone. "Thank you," he whispered. "For everything." Julia watched as Harold bowed his head, his shoulders shaking slightly. She placed a comforting hand on his back. "He would be so proud of you," she said softly. Harold nodded, a single tear sliding down his cheek. "And I'm proud to have known him," he replied. As they left the cemetery, Harold felt a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. The past no longer felt like a weight but a part of his story that had found its resolution. Months after the jewelry line's successful launch, Harold found himself standing before a packed audience at an awards ceremony. The event, held by a prestigious design association, honored individuals who had made significant contributions to the art of jewelry. Harold had been nominated for a Lifetime Achievement Award, a recognition he never dreamed of receiving. Julia and her father sat in the front row, their faces beaming with pride. When Harold's name was announced, the crowd erupted in applause. Harold rose slowly, his steps measured as he made his way to the stage. Standing at the podium, he paused, gazing out at the faces before him. "This award isn't just for me," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "It's for everyone who believed in the power of dreams. My dear friend Edmund Gray, who shared my vision. Julia Gray, who reminded me that even after years of darkness, there is always a way back to the light. And for all of you who've shown me that it's never too late to rebuild what was lost." His words hung in the air, the applause that followed carrying a weight of shared admiration. Back at the hotel, Amanda approached Harold one afternoon as he sipped tea in the lounge. Her usually rigid posture seemed softer, and there was an earnestness in her eyes. "Mr. Lewis," she began, her voice hesitant. "I wanted to say I'm sorry for how I treated you when we first met." Harold looked up, his expression kind. "Thank you," he said simply. Acknowledging our mistakes is the first step toward change. Amanda fidgeted with her hands, her cheeks flushing. I've been thinking about what you said, that kindness costs nothing but enriches everyone. I want to do better. I want to make sure no one else feels the way you did that day. Harold smiled, seeing genuine growth in her. Then you've already begun, he said. Harold soon became a cherished part of the Gray family, spending his days designing, mentoring, and sharing stories of the past. Julia insisted he move into a guest house on the family estate, a quaint cottage surrounded by gardens. At first, Harold resisted, uncomfortable with the idea of imposing. But Julia was firm. You've spent enough years wandering, Harold, she said. It's time you had a place to call home. Settling into the cottage, Harold found a sense of peace he hadn't known in decades. The mornings brought the sound of birdsong, and the evenings were filled with laughter as Julia and her family visited him to share meals and stories. For the first time in years, Harold felt truly at ease. As Harold settled into his new life, he began mentoring young designers at the Gray family's jewelry workshop. They were eager to learn from him, hanging on his every word as he shared the principles of his craft. Jewelry is more than just adornment, Harold would say. It's a story. Each piece you create should carry a message, an emotion, a memory. He guided them through the process, from sketching designs to selecting the finest materials. One young designer, Emma, showed Harold a bracelet she had crafted. It was intricate and beautiful, but Harold noticed something missing. It's technically perfect, he said, but what does it mean to you? Emma hesitated before explaining how it represented her mother's strength. Harold smiled. Now, bring that story into the design. Let others feel what you feel. Not everyone welcomed Harold's growing role in the business. A vocal critic on the board of directors questioned his influence, suggesting that his time had passed. This company needs to look forward, not backward, the man said during a heated meeting. Julia stood to respond, her voice calm but firm. Looking forward doesn't mean forgetting where we came from, she said. Harold is not just part of our past. He's helping us shape the future. Harold, ever humble, added, I don't wish to overstay my welcome. But if my experience can help, I'm happy to contribute. His sincerity disarmed the critics, and the board ultimately voted to expand Harold's role in training and design. The Grays organized a gala to celebrate the success of the revitalized jewelry line. Held in the family estate's grand ballroom, it was an evening of elegance and celebration. Guests marveled at the displays of Harold's new designs, each piece more captivating than the last. Julia took the stage to address the crowd, her voice clear and confident. Tonight, we honor not only our family's legacy but the man who made it possible, she said, gesturing to Harold. His story reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit and the beauty of second chances. Harold, standing in the wings, felt a swell of emotion as the crowd erupted in applause. The night was a testament to everything he had overcome and the new life he had built. Late that evening, after the guests had gone, Julia sat with Harold in the garden, the stars twinkling above them. It's amazing how life brings people together, she said, her voice thoughtful. If I hadn't been at that hotel that day. Harold chuckled softly. Fate has a way of surprising us, he said. Meeting you gave me a second chance I never thought I'd have. Julia smiled, her eyes glistening. And meeting you reminded me of the importance of honoring where we come from. They sat in comfortable silence, the bond between them unspoken but deeply felt. As a token of his gratitude, Harold presented Julia with a custom-designed necklace. The piece featured delicate intertwining vines and a small emerald at its center. "This is for you," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "To symbolize the connection we've forged, one that will never fade." Julia's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the gift. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you, Harold, for everything." Harold smiled, his heart full. "No, Julia. Thank you." Months after the gala, Harold received a handwritten letter, its neat script bearing the name of an old acquaintance. The letter came from a man named Charles, who had once worked as an apprentice in Harold and Edmund's original workshop. Charles, now in his 70s, had stumbled across Harold's story in the news and expressed his admiration for Harold's resilience. "He always spoke of you with such reverence," the letter read, referring to Edmund. "I wish I could see the two of you together once more, but seeing your work alive again is a gift in itself." Harold's hands trembled as he read the letter, tears welling in his eyes. The connection to his past felt like a long-lost thread, finally woven back into the fabric of his life. With Julia's encouragement, Harold invited Charles to visit the Gray estate. When Charles arrived, the two men embraced, their laughter echoing in the halls as they reminisced. Together, they pored over old sketches and photographs, bridging the years with shared memories. On Harold's 95th birthday, Julia organized an intimate celebration at the estate. Close friends, family, and Harold's men gathered in the garden, raising glasses to honor his remarkable journey. Harold sat at the head of the table, his face weathered but glowing with contentment. When the time came for Harold to speak, he stood slowly, leaning on a cane for support. The crowd fell silent, their attention fixed on him. "Life has taught me many lessons," he began, his voice steady despite his age. "The most important of them is this: it's not about what we lose, but what we find. I lost years of my life to grief and regret, but I found something far greater: hope, kindness, and the family I never knew I had." As he raised his glass, the guests erupted into applause, their admiration filling the air. Julia, standing nearby, wiped away tears. She had never felt prouder of the man who had become such an integral part of her life. Harold spent his remaining years surrounded by love and purpose. His contributions to the Gray family's business became a cornerstone of their success, his mentorship shaping a new generation of designers. On a quiet spring morning, Harold passed away peacefully in his sleep. Julia found him in his cottage, a serene smile on his face, and the watch bearing Edmund's crest still on his wrist. The family held a memorial in his honor, unveiling a new collection inspired by Harold's designs. Named the Harold Legacy, the collection became a testament to resilience, redemption, and the enduring power of kindness. Years later, Julia stood in the garden where Harold had celebrated his last birthday. She held the necklace he had made for her, its emerald catching the sunlight. "Thank you, Harold," she whispered, "for reminding us of what truly matters." And as the wind carried her words into the sky, it felt as though Harold's spirit lingered, a quiet but unyielding presence in the legacy he left behind.